Oh, hey, how you doing? Me? Oh, me? I'm doing pretty well. I was thinking about doing a video on Bloom, the new reaction. The dendro reaction coming soon? Pretty soon here? Anyway, let's talk about it. What is it, first of all? Well, it is either when you apply hydro to dendro on an enemy, or apply dendro to an enemy with hydro on it. You can see it not working here. Actually, those are not. See, so those are just little enemies. It doesn't exist yet. It's coming. Be patient. But, you know, this is just a visual. It would be happening here. Just believe. Now, is it going to be good? I'm not going to talk about that. I don't know. Is it going to be useful on its own? Do you need to do the other reactions? Look, I'm just going to talk about Bloom first, and we'll talk about the other ones later. But the use case to me is, see here, you can take a single target, for example, attack, and turn it into AoE. That is what I think one very useful aspect of Bloom, which you might see is referred to as rupture damage, when the blooms just explode. So again, I'm just going to be talking about that in particular. So let's start with the damage. How much damage does it do? Well, it's exactly the same as Overload. And that's going to be, I'm going to just ballpark it 20-something thousand. Now with Shred and all this other stuff, maybe some Elemental Mastery buffs, you get 25,000, something like that. It's pretty respectable. And again, it can take a single target damage attack and make that AoE. But this brings us to the first issue with this reaction, which is either the Hydro or the Dendro could be the trigger. Now the problem is, most of our Hydro don't really want to build Elemental Mastery, so let's say they end up triggering. Like my Yoimiya here, 3,000 something overload is just not that significant. And does that mean you're going to have to build an Elemental Mastery Yellen or Kokomi? Probably not. Another option you can do is use Elemental Mastery buffs. Here, just the 200 from Diona brings it up to 7,000. Now that's not 20,000, which we can talk about later for team building and how you can maximize it, but that is one, I think, viable way to make use out of this reaction, is instead of trying to think through like a full Elemental Mastery build, is just how do you buff the Elemental Mastery of the team? Now the other thing you can do is try to set up a trigger who does want to build up Elemental Mastery anyway. Now one issue, you see like Kazuha doesn't always want to infuse Hydra, which is what you're going to need, right? You can't infuse Dendro. Now you can, of course, just use good application of Hydro and make him infuse Hydro, and now we have a full Elemental Mastery build, Kazuha, who could, in theory, be triggering Bloom and getting full, like, 20,000 damage ruptures. So that's another option. But it's going to depend a lot about the different kits the characters have. You can see here, if I apply Pyro, and then I apply Hydro, it immediately strips it. If I apply Hydro, and then I apply Pyro to it, it doesn't. This is a strong and weak reaction. Now there is the same thing for Bloom. Applying Dendro on a Hydro aura is the strong reaction. Think of applying Hydro to Pyro. But there are some tricks around this. So one thing you can do is what's already being referred to as called fridging, which will be because Cryo can exist with Dendro, the Hydro will react to the Cryo and actually be weaker when it reacts with the Dendro, which can extend the amount of Dendro you have. Now this might mean you need the Elemental Mastery on your Hydro or whatever, but it's just a trick you can use to trigger more blooms off of the same amount of Dendro application. So the goal is going to want to be to make as many as you can, as many blooms. And so I want to talk a little bit about ICD. You'll see here I'm triggering overload damage, which is hitting all the enemies every hit of my skill, even though Kuki has what's called standard ICD on her skill. Because the overload damage is AoE, and triggering it requires application that uses the ICD of Kuki, you can just offset the ICD by hitting two different enemies with each tick. So you'll see here I hit the first but missed the second. But then I hit the second one, and now you'll see the alternating trigger of overload is still hitting both enemies every single tick. So this is the kind of thing you're going to want to be using to make as many blooms as possible. Now, not necessarily at the same time, because you might be thinking, well, isn't that just like Ganyu or Hayato's quadratic damage, where if you suck enemies in, each hit of the burst hits all of the enemies, and so the more enemies there are, the targeting means that they all take more damage. And to some extent, yes, but not exactly the way you think. You see, you do want enemies grouped up, and you do want to make as many blooms as possible, but there is actually something called a global ICD, and it's pretty apparent with overload. When you have an immense number of overloads, like in this example here, she actually overloads so much we trigger it, where it's actually every half second the enemies can only take one instance of overload. They don't all trigger overload every single time they could on each other. There is a limit. Now that limit is actually twice as good for Bloom, meaning they can each take 2 instances instead of just 1. Now, the other side of that is, so can you. And you might be thinking, well, it's okay, you take damage, is that a lot? Well, it's 5% of the damage you deal, which can add up when there is a lot. Now imagine you have Venti going in all these blooms, and it's like this, and it's spamming all of these blooms hitting you. It can really add up to a lot of damage, and it's something you need to consider when you're dealing bloom damage. So, how do you fight that damage? Well, run a healer, okay? That's the first thing, probably. Now, you see my Bennett here takes a couple thousand damage, and I tried a couple different ways you might try to mitigate that. The first obvious one I did was Xingqiu. He's Hydro, you're going to want to use that anyway, but nope. Other than the spot heals, if you're not using his burst, just his E helps, but the damage reduction does nothing to stop the overload damage here. I even tried defense, and just like all transformative reactions actually, they bypass defense. And so buffing your defense doesn't work either. You still take the same damage. Now there is one thing that does work, and that is resistance, which is different than defense and damage reduction. And there is the 4-element resonance, which actually will increase your resistance to all elements, and that includes dendro. So you'll see here, this is not a rainbow team, right? I have 2 pyro, so I don't have the rainbow resistance. But when I do have 4 different elements, the damage is reduced. And you might have that on a team that's like Hydro, Dendro, Animo, and a Cryo if you're doing bridging. And of course the other thing you can do to mitigate the damage is, of course, maybe just run Zhongli, who is rerunning. Coincidentally? Maybe. I don't know. He probably fits in somewhere. So you can do that too. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about team building, and where would you put it in, why would you use it, etc. So there's a lot of teams, here's an example which I think would have an easy fit. It's a lot of single target damage. Kokomi, Yalan, Fischl, and it's high single target damage, right? All 3 of them are mostly single target damage dealers, and for bosses and things like that, it's quite good. We still have some clam damage from Kokomi, we still have some AoE from Kazuha, some electrocharge damage, but there's still room to grow. So what you could do is swap out, for example, Fischl, and pop in a Dendro there. There's enough Hydro here where probably your Dendro would be building Elemental Mastery. You could use a better grouper like Venti and get more Rupture damage that way. Now you might also try running a double Dendro team here or whatever, but even though your Hydros are mostly single target, you're still making a lot of AoE damage because of the Ruptures, and you want to structure your team that way. Now I want to dig in a little bit about the characters I think will benefit pretty greatly from this reaction, and I want to start with the Hydro, which is the most obvious, because you definitely need a lot of Hydro to make this work. And starting with Ayato, his burst is quadratic scaling. The more enemies are grouped up, the more Hydro application he actually has, and his slashes are AoE. So generally speaking, he can make a ton of blooms. Okay, now look at Child, who has so many sources of Hydro. His actual slashes of his normal and charge attacks, the Riptide damage, right? All of those have separate ICDs from each other, and that means that he has so much Hydro application, he can maybe even keep up with 2 different Dendros. Now we have Yalan, who is a huge single target damage dealer, who has strong buffs for your team, just a great unit, and this can actually make her single target damage AoE. And also Kokomi, who has a similar thing where she's mostly single target when she's on field anyways. She does have AoE with a jellyfish, but she also is healing, making up for that rupture damage. Okay, I also want to look at Animo, and an important aspect of Animo, instead of just infusing like you can with Kazuha. You see here my Yalan's single target Hydro is being swirled, and the swirl damage will actually trigger Bloom also, and that will also help take your single target Hydro and trigger more AoE Blooms. So that's going to be your characters like Venti, for example, who also provides the grouping you need to make this work, and if he can trigger it because of a Hydro infused burst, even better. You'll saw I already demoed Sayu. Now Sayu is a healer, also going to help with the Bloom, but again, it's the constant swirling that she's able to do, which will make that spreading of the Hydro trigger more Blooms. And Sucrose does a similar thing. She can infuse Hydro, she can group some enemies, and she's also buffing your Elemental Mastery, which is going to increase the damage your entire team does with Bloom. And of course, then there's Kazuha, who can group enemies, who can infuse Hydro. At C2, he can buff Elemental Mastery. Basically, he is broken now and will probably continue to be broken. So there's that. So what should you do in the meantime between now and Sumeru? Well, my first thought would be maybe spend a little bit of time and invest in your Traveler. We're going to get a free copy of the Dendro Traveler, and you can do a lot of the work to level them up and build them now. Now, you may not need to take them to 90, however, if they are triggering the Blooms, and they're going to be the ones doing that damage, you're not using Hyper Bloom or Burgeoning or whatever, their damage will scale with Elemental Mastery in their level, and the difference will be about 30% from 80 to 90 alone. If they're Elemental Mastery, you may not need to level their talents, but if you do need to level their talents, it's a pain, takes all the different books, and you will have to wait for Sumeru for that. We'll get a couple of constellations, but look, the point is, they're going to be a decent character, they're going to be usable, but you're going to want to level them. But the cool thing is, you don't need to wait to Sumeru to do it now. And you can get a workable build. What we know for now is that they're going to generally need a lot of energy to recharge. You're going to want their burst up anyway. So using something like Favonius Sword or maybe Sacrificial. And you can even start with whatever scrap pieces of the Emblem of Severed Fate, or pretty much whatever you have. The point is you want the Dendro application. So that's what I would do, starting out now. We know that Blooms will explode when there's 5 on the field, or they've been on the field 6 seconds, so we're likely to see some Bloom or Rupture damage. But we know we can blow them up with Pyro and Electro to get the other reactions, Burgeoning and Hyper Bloom. And it's just as likely that that will be the way we want to use Bloom as a reaction. And so that'll be the topic of my next video. And so, like, sub, check the notifications, etc. Come hang out, and let's figure out what the heck to do with this stuff before Sumeru comes, so we know how to build our teams, and so on. Thanks. Bye.